Thanks everyone for coming to the Immigration Law Association Socialism versus Capitalism debate. My name is Samantha Escalon and I am the president of ILA. And I also want to give a quick thank you to Professor Strange, Dean Chapman, Blake, and Stephanie for helping me put this together. And so our speakers have a lot to cover in a short amount of time. So I'm just going to give a brief introduction to each speaker and then we'll get started. So first up, we have John Miltimore. He is the managing editor of the Foundation for Economic Education.org. His writing and reporting has been the subject of articles in Time Magazine, The Wall Street Journal, CNN, Forbes, Fox News, and the Star Tribune. He previously served in editorial roles at the History Channel magazine, Intellectual Takeout, and Scout. He's an alumni of the Institute for Human Studies Journalism program, a former reporter of the Panama City News Herald, and served as an intern in the speech writing department of George W. Bush. Next up, we have Ben Burgis, and Ben is a Jacobin columnist and adjunct philosophy professor at Rutgers University, and the host of the YouTube show and podcast, Give Them an Argument. He's the author of several books, most recently Christopher Hitchens, What He Got Right, How He Went Wrong, and Why He Still Matters. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to the speakers. Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
All right. First, I want to thank John for participating and Samantha and the rest for organizing this and putting us up at a hotel. I love this. It's actually called the Overton. So for anybody who's not familiar, the Overton window is a term that political commentators often use to talk about the range of ideas that are considered to be even, realistically imaginable enough that they're even up for debate. Now, for most of my lifetime in this country, socialism was way outside of that window. And I'm not even that old. But little by little, that is starting to change. Last Thursday, the House of Representatives held a vote to, and I quote, condemn the horrors of socialism. And I'm quite certain that if they'd held this vote in 2013, it would have been unanimous. Every Democrat, every Republican, no question. In 2023, there were 86 nay votes, plus, 14 little weasels who voted present. And that's a remarkable change. In 2023, it seems a lot of politicians know that their constituents don't want them to denounce the horrors of socialism. Why not? What changed? Well, my take would be that a big part of what changed is that the fruit of the right wing's long war against labor unions and the regulatory state, the Reagan era onward, has churned back the clock to what is, in some important respects, a purer form of capitalism. Not as pure as libertarians would like, certainly, but a lot purer than what we had. Think about the difference between unionized cab drivers with health insurance and retirement plans and Uber drivers. And living under a purer form of capitalism, which is a different way of saying living in a hellscape of financial stress and economic precarity, has made a lot more Americans open to what socialists are saying. They don't want their congressmen to denounce the horrors of socialism because they associate the S word with two things. First, the tremendously positive reform proposals that Bernie Sanders has introduced to our national conversation. Things like moving toward Medicare for all, so that when you were sick, you could just see a doctor, kind of the way that if your house is on fire, the fire department doesn't meet you on the lawn to collect a copay before they put out the fire. And so that's one thing. And then the other, I think, is a little bit harder to pin down, but it's very important, which is that a lot of people can't articulate what alternative they would want, but they tell pollsters they're favorable to socialism because they have a strong intuitive sense that there's something that's just fundamentally not right about the economic structures that rule their lives. And I'm going to argue that they're right to feel this way on both counts. That socialist policies like nationalizing the health insurance industry, which is a different way of saying Medicare for all, would be tremendously beneficial in the here and now. They could also be thought of as baby steps in the direction of reorganizing the whole structure of our economy in a fundamentally more just and reasonable way. So let's touch on that part. What could that look like? Broadly speaking, socialism means social ownership of economic enterprises. Doesn't necessarily mean state ownership, although that is one form it could take. State ownership could be a form of social ownership as long as society as a whole democratically owns the state. I'm not advocating recreating East Germany. I'd like something that would be better than either that or what we have right now. Social ownership could also mean turning businesses currently owned by stockholders or by individual rich people into worker-owned cooperatives. And I know that if we're ever lucky enough, from my perspective, to get to a fully socialist economy, look, the process of real historical change is always messy, it's always unpredictable. I'm sure it would involve a mishmash of both of those forms that I just mentioned, as well as various forms of local and community ownership. And I also know that if it ever happens, it's not going to be an overnight change. It's going to be a very long process. But I do think it should be our North Star, the goal we never lose sight of, both because every step we take in that direction makes life better for the majority of Americans, and because so many of the cruelest things about the society that we have right now are downstream from the basic way economic power works under capitalism. Think, for example, about our frankly psychotic levels of economic inequality. CEOs making hundreds of times the salary of average workers. And then think about the alternative. So if Amazon, for example, were a worker co-op, you might not have completely flat wage scales. You might have to pay some people a little bit more than others to incentivize them to take particularly demanding jobs with a lot of stress and responsibility, or on the other end to take particularly dangerous or unpleasant jobs. But if you showed up to the meeting where everyone was voting on wage scales and said, hey guys, I was thinking, this whole company was Jeff's idea, so why don't we pay him so much more than the rest of us that he'll be able to buy his own spaceship? You know, good luck. I don't think you're going to win the vote. So that brings me to my final point. I know that some of you are probably thinking, okay, Ben, socialism sounds lovely and all, but it's just not realistic. It goes against human nature. People aren't kind and cooperative the way socialism would need them to be. They're selfish, they're competitive, so it wouldn't work. And I think that concern gets things exactly backwards. Because if human beings were angels, capitalism would be vastly less objectionable than it actually is. We wouldn't need to worry about bosses abusing their power over workers because we just trust them to be kind and benevolent. We wouldn't need to worry about all sorts of avoidable human misery coming out of these levels of economic inequality because people with less could always fundamentally count on the generosity of people with more. But I'm afraid we're not angels, so we'll just have to be socialists instead.
Can everyone hear me okay? Thank you all for attending here today. And thanks to Samantha and Ben and David and the university for putting this on. It's an incredibly important conversation to have. And we need more discussions like this. There's too much silencing going on campuses today. We need more of this. We need more interaction. Let's talk about ideas. It's like the great English poet John Milton once said, let truth and falsehood grapple. Whoever knew truth to get the worst of that fight. We should also be thankful that we're participating in this debate. I couldn't help but think of the hundreds of millions of people who wouldn't have been allowed to participate in a debate about the virtue of capitalism. Think Pol Pot would have allowed that? Or Mao? Lenin? Stalin? I don't think so. And why not? I say this not to just score cheap points at the expense of my opponent. Well, that's partly the reason I do it. But I want to make a simple point. Economic freedom and political freedom, they go hand in hand. You can't just put the word democratic in front of socialism and render it benign. History shows this. And it shows it most recently in Venezuela. We saw Hugo Chavez. He was a Bernie Sanders style populist, right? He talked about wage justice. He talked about evil corporations. By his second term, he had dropped the democratic part of socialist. He just called himself a socialist. He said, let it all be nationalized. And that's what he did. Chavez nationalized everything from mining to agriculture, to tourism, communications, and beyond. And it worked for a few years, right? It did. You can go back and see, as recently as 2013, you can see some publications, I think it was Salon, that talked about the economic miracle of Venezuelan socialism. Raise your hand if you think what happened in Venezuela was a miracle. Anyone? It wasn't a miracle. We know that. It was a nightmare. And about 8 million people have fled that country. Venezuela was in the top 10 wealthiest countries in 1950. In 1959, it had a higher GDP per capita than the United States. Today, people are starving. And it's one thing to read about 1,000,000% inflation, right? It's a different thing to hear about it from people who fled. I've had the opportunity to talk to a handful of people, 5 or 6, who fled Venezuela. It's heartbreaking. Their parents hand them a fistful of money and send them to America to escape. Their families are still there. The median wage is about about $8 a month. A bag of onions costs about $2 a month, to put that in perspective. This is a history we can't repeat. We need to learn from history, right? We need to make that simple point I made: political freedom, economic freedom, they go hand in hand. And I don't think enough people understand this. It's funny, when I came, I told people I was coming down to debate capitalism and socialism. People were a little surprised, they were shocked. Like, people are still talking about this? And I get where they're coming from. I was 10 years old when the Berlin Wall came down. I remember the euphoria that day. People in the streets celebrating. This evil empire that had caused so much pain and suffering was collapsing before our eyes. I was young, but you knew something big was happening, and it was. The system was collapsing for everyone to see. And there was a sense that capitalism had triumphed, right? Socialism had been vanquished. Except that didn't happen. Ideas do not die as easily as political systems do. And Marxism lives on. In some ways, it's ascendant. We speak like Marxists today often. We use language, even sometimes without knowing it. We view the world through these class structures now. And this isn't progress. And in some ways, you have to hand it to Marx and his disciples, really. It's almost impressive in a way. Marx might have been a failure as a man. He was a lousy husband. He was a terrible father. He was a drunkard. He was a racist. He was a horrible economist. But he did something incredible. He turned this word capitalism into a dirty word. And it's astonishing when you look at that, because in the 2 centuries since Marx was born, we've seen this amazing progress. When Marx was born in 1818, absolute poverty was at 90%. Globally, 90%. We forget how mean the average existence was for somebody before capitalism. They lived at about 2,000 calories a day, the average person. People were caught in nutritional traps. They couldn't even work. They lacked the energy to work. Capitalism changed all that. It ushered in this industrial explosion that Marx despised. He looked at it as exploitive. But it changed the world in ways that we can't even imagine today. It unleashed entrepreneurship, ingenuity. And you don't need a bunch of GDP data to show you that, right? You look back at life in 1820, you look at life today. And in fact, you go to the year I was born, 1979. You look at all the things we had, dishwashers and all those things, automobiles, but look at absolute poverty. It had fallen from 90% to 36% when I was born. And get this, in my lifetime alone, absolute poverty, according to the World Bank, has fallen from 36% to 8%. This is the power of capitalism. So let's ask, well, what is capitalism, right? I'll make it very simple. Capitalism is economic freedom, okay? I can do it in one word. Best definition for capitalism you can find. It's consent. It's consent within an economic system. And it's this idea that I can't take from you and you can't take from me. All action is voluntary, okay? It's mutual exchange. This is a healthy system. And it doesn't just breed prosperity. It breeds harmony. And it's the opposite of socialism. In the womb of every socialist, you'll find force. They want to use coercion. And again, I don't look at Ben as a bad person. I think Ben wants what's best. I truly do. But force is not the way to build a productive society or a peaceful one. And I'll close my initial remarks just with a quote from the great economist and philosopher Ludwig von Mises. And he said, when somebody offers you a glass of cold milk and a glass of potassium cyanide, they're not offering you a drink. They're offering you a choice between life and death. And that truly is the choice between socialism and capitalism. We need to get this right. It's incumbent on us to get it right if we want to leave our children a world better than the one we found.
Okay, thank you, Ben and John. And now we're going to transition into a conversation between Ben and John, and we're going to listen in.
All right. If this makes sense to you, I will, we were originally going to do 15 minutes each, and then we said, let's make it a little bit more flexible and informal than that. But if I could just do a few minutes on some of the stuff you just said, and then kind of let you do that, and then we'll transition it to be more open exchange. Sure. All right. So the first thing you said is you were thinking about the hundreds of millions of people who wouldn't have been able to have a discussion about the merits of capitalism. And that made me think about all the people who lived in countries where they wouldn't have been allowed to have conversation about the merits of socialism. If you tried to show up to a debate like this on the socialist side, in, for example, Chile, under the reign of General Pinochet, who was installed in a CIA-backed coup to overthrow the democratic socialist Salvador Allende in 1973, you probably would have literally been hanging out of a helicopter. That's what they did to dissident socialists and labor unionists in Chile at the time that people like Milton Friedman were flying down to give General Pinochet economic advice about how to do shock therapy and invent a lot of what we now think of as neoliberalism. If you were in Indonesia under Suharto, who committed in East Timor, proportionally speaking, the largest genocide since Hitler, that the terms of the percentage of the population that he killed, and who certainly committed mass murder within Indonesia itself on a blood-curdling scale, you certainly wouldn't have been able to advocate for the virtues of socialism. Suharto, too, was enthusiastically supported by the United States for standard Cold War anti-communist reasons. In fact, if you think about the four people that John just mentioned, Pol Pot, Mao, Lenin, Stalin, the first one, I think, is an accounting error. He's transferred that item between sides of the Cold War, because actually what happened in Cambodia is that when Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge, was engaged in precisely the opposite of what socialists of every kind have always advocated, and deindustrializing the country, Vietnam, authoritarian communist country, plenty of criticisms, but Vietnam invaded Cambodia to stop the killing, and the United States openly supported Pol Pot as a thorn in the side of Vietnam, which had just embarrassed us, of course, over the course of the 60s and 70s, and its backer, the Soviet Union. This is not a conspiracy theory. You can look at the UN votes, right? The votes to give Pol Pot rather than the Vietnamese-backed government the Cambodia's UN seat, for example. He mentioned Venezuela. He said Chavez nationalized everything. I cannot overstate how false that is. Even by the time Hugo Chavez died, the public sector in Venezuela was a little bit larger than the United States, not much, as an overall employer, the percentage of the population employed by the public sector. But it was a little bit larger than the United States, way smaller. It was like a smaller percentage than France, never mind any of the Nordic countries. And while we're on the subject of the Nordic countries, I do find it very significant that the one place in the world where he could claim, oh, look, democratic socialists, but then something that if you're sort of squinting enough to make everything blurry, you could make look like communism, even though it had a smaller public sector than France. He didn't mention any of the places where democratic socialists have had the most profound effect on their societies. Places like Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark. Now, what libertarians and conservatives always say about these places is, oh, no, see, those are capitalist countries. No, I agree. Those are places where democratic socialist policies, while they've been implemented and had a tremendously beneficial effect on people's lives, literally making the difference between life and death for many reasons, many preventable deaths, from disease, for example. There are many situations in which people might die in the United States and live in Sweden. But they haven't completely transcended capitalism, as I would use that term. But here's the point. There is no possible way to classify Venezuela as socialist and Sweden or Norway as capitalist. It cannot be done because the public sector as an employer is a way bigger part of the economy in those countries than it is in Venezuela. In fact, Norway is an almost ideal laboratory comparison, because both of them are countries that are very oil dependent. Both of them have big public sectors that are inflated by a largely state-owned, in much the same way, oil company. And if you go and look at Matt Bruening's People's Policy Project, their stats on this, the overall amount of wealth in the Norwegian economy that's held by the Norwegian state is way bigger than the overall amount of wealth held by the Venezuelan state, in the Venezuelan economy. And by any conceivable measures, places like Norway and Sweden are some of the most livable societies that have ever been built by human beings. They consistently cream global happiness surveys, even though these are places where the sun is shining for like 2 hours a year and it's incredibly cold. That, I think, tells you something.
Can I interject now, Ben? I won't be able to respond to all this unless we get some back and forth.
Go for it.
So there's a lot to respond to there. If you talk to anyone from Finland or Sweden or Norway, they're going to tell you, we're not socialists. And their own political leaders say, no. And they're right, they're free market economies. They're like ours, they're a mixed economy. These aren't socialist states. These are mixed economies. And as far as Venezuela, it's interesting. We've seen this over and over and over again, where it's not real socialism once it fails. Christian Niemitz has a book on this, and it goes painstaking into the detail.
What's the standard for real socialism?
Excuse me, I gave you the floor. Now I'm talking. If you look, it's always the same story. You can go read Jacobin, you can go read Salon, you can go read Mother Jones, and it's socialist until it's not, until it fails. We've seen this time and again. And let's talk about Cambodia for a minute. Pol Pot. Does anybody know where Pol Pot was educated? Anyone? Ben? He was educated in Paris, okay? He studied, he wrote a dissertation on Marxism. Many in the Khmer Rouge did the same. They studied these ideas seriously. And when they came, it was almost like we were exporting Marxism to these other countries. They came back, they took their ideas. And if you can look at how the degree to which they planned this society. They looked at every family. You know what? This is hilarious. Everybody got 2 desserts a week in the first year, okay? The next year, everybody was going to get dessert every other day. And by year 3, everybody, I think, was going to get dessert every day of the week. And they said, okay, here's how many knives and scissors we need. They planned this entire economy as if a handful of people can get together and they have the knowledge to possess, to engineer the society in a way that makes sense. This is what the Nobel Prize winning economist F.A. Hayek called the knowledge problem. You have all these bean counters in rooms, they get together and they think they possess the knowledge. You can't. Nobody can engineer an economy so vast and complex. It takes incredible hubris to think you can do this. It's astonishing to me, something so complex that we think, well, we just get some smart people in a room together and they can figure this out and they can make things better. And I want to touch on one last thing. Ben earlier was talking about labor unions and the need for them and how they're ascended today. I don't think you can find better examples of unions being crushed. And you can go back and study the early Soviet Union. The first thing Lenin did, you had these small Soviets, they thought, finally, we have control, we have power. He abolished the right to strike. In capitalism, if you don't want to work, you go find another job. In the USSR, they put a bullet in your head or sent you to a concentration camp. These union workers who threw their lot behind the Bolsheviks were crushed. They were absolutely crushed. And Lenin didn't shy away from terror. Again, it's like I said, because this is necessary for the revolution. You can go back and find this grand language in Marx about ushering in this social revolution. I'll share one quote with you that I found fascinating. We are a workers' party because we see in the coming battle between finance and labor the end of the structure of the century. We are on the side of labor and against finance. The value of labor under socialism will be determined by its value to the state, to the whole community. Does that sound like a good idea to anyone? Does that sound like a good idea to you, Ben?
Well, if it's my turn to talk again, I would say that that I'm really confused by what the standard is for what you would consider to be real socialism. So I said what I mean by socialism in the opening statement. John has a different definition in mind. Fair enough, right? We can talk about the desirability of socialism as he defines it. But I would be fascinated to know, what's the definition of real socialism that would somehow perform the minor semantic miracle of including Venezuela, but excluding Norway, even though the state sector is a much bigger part of the economy in Norway than in Venezuela? We heard a lot about how bad Pol Pot was, which, for the record, I agree. Pol Pot was really bad. So I think it's good that I don't have a lot of nice things to say about the capital C communist countries in the Cold War, but one thing you can say about it is that the Soviet bloc and the Vietnam tried to stop him, and the CIA, the United States, openly supported him. And I think it was good to try to stop him and bad to support him. But pulling back from that specific case, and I think even by the standards of capital C communism, which is certainly not something I advocate, Pol Pot's Cambodia was about as different from, say, the Soviet Union in what it was trying to do to the economy in many ways than you could hope for to find in a society. Right, the entire trajectory of the rest of those countries was industrialization, and in Cambodia you have intentional deindustrialization. That's very different. Now he says it violates his capitalist ideals. Fair enough, and it violates my socialist ideals too. But I also want to take, I think it would be an incredible waste of everybody's time to spend our time already talking about the demerits of a society that's nothing like anything that either of us has ever advocated. And I think it's a much better idea to talk about what somebody like me would advocate and somebody like John would be opposed to. Because ultimately, if you're talking to a democratic socialist and you spend your whole time talking about the horrors of Stalinism, then that's a little bit like arguing about religion with a Baptist and spending your whole time talking about all the terrible things that the Roman Catholic Church has done, and what about the Inquisition, and what about the Crusades. and say, okay, dude, you got the wrong number. You know, go take that up with somebody who's going to defend the infallibility of the Pope to you. Now, John says that you can't separate economic freedom from political freedom, and I just want to make two really quick points about this, because this is, I think, right, unlike the stuff about Cambodia, this one is actually right at the core of what we actually disagree about. Because first, accepting for the sake of argument John's understanding of what economic freedom is, that the lesson of history is unambiguously, of course you can separate so-called economic freedom from political freedom. It has been separated over and over and over again in many different countries. He says that in capitalism you have a right to strike. That would be a hell of a surprise to people in a lot of capitalist countries where they have not had the right to strike. Now, John can say, well, those weren't real capitalist countries because real capitalism means that you have political freedom, but then you can't separate economic freedom from political freedom, just becomes an uninformative tautology. Certainly, as a matter of history, there are many of the worst and most murderous authoritarian countries in history, in the history of the last 100 years, have in fact presided over economies that were largely in privately owned hands. That's one point. Second point, let's talk about economic freedom, because that's where John ended his opening statement. He talked about how capitalism is all about voluntariness and consent, and socialism is about force and coercion. And I think that is 100% wrong. I think when you say, oh, capitalism, respecting capitalist property rights, that's really what we're talking about, right? Saying, don't take away some from to give to others, either by doing things like Medicare for all, those baby steps I talked about, or by trying to move towards an economy where you didn't have a separation between a class of workers and class of capitalists in much the way I was talking about in my opening statement. So no, you can't do that because that's coercion. That violates voluntariness. Okay, what's the principle here? If the principle is you can't take away somebody's property that's theirs, then the question is theirs in which sense? Certainly can't be legally theirs. You can't say, oh, people have a moral right to hold on to whatever property they sort of hold a legal title to, because then, of course, if it's being done through a political process, you've changed the laws, you have, for example, passed a law to tax people, or you have passed a law to nationalize something, then legally it is not their property. So what we're talking about is what's morally theirs, what people have a moral claim to, but then saying it's morally wrong to take away what people have a moral claim to is completely vacuous. It's completely uninformative. I could sign on to that. A lot of those capitalist and communist dictators that John was going on about, I think somewhat off topic for debate with me, but fine. They could sign on to it too, right? Because everybody believes that people have a moral right to whatever they have a morally legitimate claim to. The real debate is always, what do people have a morally legitimate claim to? What is our theory of legitimate holdings? Is it that just let the chips fall where they may in a free market, or do we believe in something more like John Rawls's theory of justice, that in fact the economic institutions are right if you would endorse them if you didn't know who you were going to be? You didn't know if you're going to be born into a rich family or a poor family. You didn't know if you're going to have the particular set of skills it would take to climb the ladder of upward mobility. Then would you endorse that society? And there's a really substantive debate to be had between, just sticking with those two examples for the sake of brevity, because I want to throw back to John, but there's a really substantive debate to be had between those two conceptions of what makes something a morally legitimate claim on a piece of property, but it has absolutely nothing to do with coercion. Right? That's just a giant red herring. What we're always arguing about is who has a moral right to what the distribution should be. Of course, whether it's with a no trespassing sign or a letter from the IRS, any possible distribution of scarce resources, right? Some people are excluded from using resources that are held by others, is always going to be enforced by coercion. That's inevitable in any possible society. The real question is always, which distribution of resources should we enforce?
Yeah, I guess I'll respond to that. There's a few things. And to me, it's quite simple. You don't have a moral claim on other people's stuff. You just don't. You can go back to the philosophy of this, where Locke talks about once you mixed your labor with something, that it's yours, and people don't have the right to take that from you. Now, today, we say that the state has the right to take your property. They have the legal right. They have a monopoly on force. And what happens if you don't pay your taxes? Well, they'll exercise that force, right? People have to follow it. This is sort of like legal plunder, in the words of Bastiat, the 19th century economist. And he saw the law being perverted in this way, where we create government to protect life, liberty, and property. That's its purpose. But Bastiat saw, no, government's becoming a tool of plunder. We're going to go take it from you without your consent. We're going to use it for some sort of purpose over here that we think is good. And we have the moral claim to do that. And I reject that claim. I want to go back, and I think Ben made a really good point talking about defining socialism, okay? This isn't easy to do, by the way. And I think it's especially difficult with Marxists because they like to change the definition of socialism a lot. And I'll concede something. There never has been an entirely capitalist state, nor has there ever been an entirely socialist state. You think of the most prominent examples of socialism in history, and like Lenin's war communism. Well, Lenin backed off that pretty fast. He instituted his own market reforms known as the New Economic Policy because it was a disaster. And Lenin himself conceded it wasn't working. And same with Stalin's efforts to collectivize farming when he declared war on the kulaks, starved millions. It was a disaster, and Stalin himself returned a percentage of land to the peasants to own and operate themselves. And guess what? Those were the most productive parcels of land in the Soviet Union. They helped keep the collectivized farming upright because they were so much more productive. And it's the same thing with Mao's Great Leap Forward. Millions died. It was an utter disaster. GDP collapsed. And what came next? It was the household responsibility policy that they ushered in I think 1978 or 1979. And they said, this isn't working. And China, communist China, privatized mass amounts of their economy. And guess what? Poverty collapsed in communist China. You can go look up the data. Anybody have an idea in China today, the people that live in absolute poverty? It's less than 1%. And you can track that. It followed as China went on this mass privatization, policy. And my point in reciting all this is, no, there's never been a country that's entirely capitalist either. The United States, from the onset, like it had things like slavery, which is a evil coercive policy. It's not capitalism. They had tariffs. They had these things that were going to extract things. It was not a capitalist utopia. Right after the Constitution was ratified, one of the first things lawmakers in Washington wanted to do was pass a whiskey tax, right? Like that made people angry, and they scrapped that pretty quick. But they said, no, you don't have a right to our property. This was the ideals that we fought a war for. But I think if you do look at socialism, you see that there are moments, like even the hardcore command style economies, when they exist, they retreat from that very quickly, and they retreat from that for a reason. They don't have the knowledge to control this economy in a way that makes sense, and they've been disastrous everywhere they've been tried. And maybe Ben's right. Maybe somewhere we'll find the secret sauce, and we'll get socialism right. That we're gonna have socialism work. I'll tell you. You can go ask the president of Denmark if they're a socialist economy. There's things that we can look up. This isn't hard to measure. We have indexes that rank countries by the amount of economic freedom they have. It's ridiculous to think that Finland and Norway were real socialism, but Venezuela was not. I'll go back to it. Anybody that wants to go to a computer and Google, Venezuela was real socialism until it failed.
According to who?
Until it failed. To Jacobin, to Salon. Go back and, yeah.
Find in the Jacobin article where it says Venezuela is a socialist country.
We can go back and look at this.
You also notice I never said that Venezuela is real socialism and Finland is not. I said that if what you mean by socialism is state ownership,
I'll finish my point. I didn't interrupt you. I'll finish my point.
Venezuela, that is just an empirical fact.
I'll finish my point. Go back, read the speeches of Hugo Chavez. He literally said, "Let it all be nationalized." He was a true believer, right? He was going to usher in the socialist utopia. It's a living example of the failure of trying to plan an economy with a handful of people. Maduro, and just recently, Maduro started turning to privatization to try to say, like, this isn't working. They quietly gave properties back to capitalists. Now, the state's still taking a massive share, but they're admitting we don't have the knowledge to control the economy. You know what? Harnessing self-interest of people working together, that's how you have economic growth. That is how we've witnessed so much over the last 2 centuries. And it's, you know, I have a feeling that we'll be arguing this 100 years from now. Hopefully not. But it's one of these things, if you look, you compare wealth and freedom in capitalist countries to those socialist countries, it's really not even close. And I'll make a final point. And this is where I think a capitalist society is more harmonious. Because socialism at its core, it's driven by envy. They want you to envy what Elon Musk has, okay? Those billionaires. I follow some Marxists on Twitter. It's nonstop churning, making you want what somebody else has and what somebody else has earned. And it's interesting. I thought of this recently. In the 10 Commandments, there's this, they said, thou shalt not covet, right? And that makes sense to people. They said, don't covet their wife, or don't covet their wife's servant, or male or female. And there's this thing like, don't even covet their house or their donkey. And that, for years, I'm like, what the hell does that even mean? Like, don't covet their donkey. But I think the message is there. We're not supposed to look at other people's stuff and want it, and to say, no, that's ours. I think that breeds in people a very unhealthy thing, to sit there and yearn for somebody else's possessions. And I think that's why this debate keeps happening. I think Marxists are human envy is something we all struggle with, right? Every one of us has looked out in the world and said, like, I want that. And I think Marxists tap into that very effectively. And they use that to try to make people, to breed discontent in people, and to look at the world and say, the world's not right. I should have more, and give us power. It's a rotten philosophy.
Yeah, literally what he just said, you could say to a Soviet dissident, oh, you're looking out at the world and saying, oh, I should be able to start my own business. This isn't right. I should have more. Now, the real question is, should you, in fact, be able to have more? In other words, what is a reasonable moral principle that tells us who should have what? Now, I explained earlier why just saying, well, you can't take other people's stuff, begs the question. Why it's a completely vacuous and uninformative statement, because the real question is always, what is, morally speaking, your stuff? Again, the stuff you have a legal title to? If so, all of his objections to the government taking things away disappear, into thin air, right? Like a vampire at sunrise, because legally speaking, whatever proportion of your money you owe on taxes is the property of the IRS. So it's not that. So it's a moral claim, right? And if you have the courage of your convictions, you should be able to argue the moral claim on its own. Here's why I find, Rawlsian justice theory, unconvincing. Make your case, fine, but don't change the subject of this thing about coercion and voluntariness. Also, don't change the subject if you're arguing about anything that I would call socialism, or have ever called socialism, or the Jacobin magazine has ever called socialism, or at least the kind of socialism that we would advocate. Don't change the subject to the kinds of things that we've always been extremely critical of, like the Soviet Union. I also find it fascinating that out of, on the one hand, John says you can't separate economic and political freedom. On the other hand, he says that that China is a capitalist success story. Well, China's a capitalist success story, and economic freedom means capitalism. You damn well can separate political and economic freedom, and China has done that. I want to talk about the economic freedom indexes, because this is the only real counter-argument I heard to the point that, look, the Norwegian state, the Swedish state, the Finnish state, the Danish state I think you're thinking of the Prime Minister of Denmark, Rasmussen, who said, oh, no, there's nothing socialist about any of this. Yeah, guy is representing a center-right party. Ask a representative of the Social Democratic Party that actually built his country's welfare state whether he thinks those achievements had anything to do with the ideals of socialism, and you'll get a completely different answer. I never said that any of these were real socialist countries. I'm just stating the obvious fact that if what you're talking about is the proportion, the role of the public sector in the state, then the fact would remain that these are much more socialist by that standard than Venezuela is. We never heard from John the alternate standard that would somehow render Venezuela more socialist than Norway or Denmark or Sweden or Finland. All we heard is that Chavez said some super socialist things in speeches, which I guess matters more than the actual proportion of the Venezuelan economy that's taken up by the public sector. I have more to say about this, but I am reading body language here and thinking that there's probably time to go to the closing statements.
Yes, please.
All right.
Would you like to go?
Yeah, sure. All right. I will just transition seamlessly to saying what I was saying, but saying it up here. So, we heard a lot of things that I find really interesting just now. We heard about economic freedom indexes, for example. We heard a lot about Marx and Marxism. But I'm a little bit confused because in a denunciation of Marx and Marxism, putting aside, I agree that Marx probably had a drinking problem. So if the question under dispute is like, is Karl Marx in heaven, then we can have a whole different debate about that. But if the question under dispute is about the man and his ideas, then I'm real confused about how I heard a denunciation of Marx and Marxism that was combined with a restatement of something that Marx spent quite a bit of his time talking about. The core of Karl Marx's theory of history is that the development of the forces of production over time leads to the changes in the economic structure of any society. As an old structure becomes a fetter on the further development of the forces of production, then you get a new one that comes in. And even if you read the Communist Manifesto, opening pages are on and on and on about what we just heard essentially from John, which is capitalism is better than feudalism. I agree. I also think extending the democracy from politics to the economy, which is what socialism needs to be, would be better than capitalism. That's what we disagree about. We don't disagree about whether the Soviet Union was a model society, so I'm very confused by how much time we spent talking about that in this debate. But I do want to talk about countries that are more relevant to our disagreements, because we heard the stuff about the Whiskey Rebellion, that, oh, that was taken away, like that was like sort of a positive example of the revolutionary fervor of 1776 being extended because they were taking away what was theirs. Well, I mean, if we're hearing an argument against taxation, he's not just arguing against what I want. He's arguing against things that the overwhelming majority of ordinary people have tremendously positive views about, things like Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare for seniors, etc., all of which are redistributive, taxpayer-funded programs. Economic Freedom Index, real quick. You can read an article I wrote about this for Jacobin in fall 2021 called Economic Freedom Rankings Don't Tell Us Anything About Capitalism. So I'm just mentioning that to show my work. But if you actually look into the methodology of these things, they're invariably a disaster. You end up with these bizarre results like, Haiti is less capitalist than Sweden. In fact, one of the most famous of these rankings said Ukraine became less capitalist between 1980 and 2000, when the Soviet Union fell halfway in between. How do they get that result? They get that result because, this is the Fraser Institute rankings, because they define all the bad things as definitionally socialist and all the good things as definitionally capitalist. If there's security and rule of law and less corruption, they define all that as capitalism. You get capitalism points for that, even if half your economy is nationalized. So, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Norway, places that have actually gone further than any society in the world in implementing the stuff that I want and John doesn't. Not as far as I would like. You're right. There's still capitalist countries and the foundations of their economy. I would prefer that if you still have to have a market sector because of knowledge problems, it at least be a non-market sector of competing worker co-ops. But these are all places where these economic freedom rankings will tell you, oh no, these are super capitalist, to which I would simply say, man, if we could have a much bigger percentage of the economy controlled by the public sector than Venezuela, never mind France, never mind the United States, and still be capitalist, then I hope that John, even if he wouldn't go as far as I would at least endorse that.
Before I start my closing statement, I just want to respond to one or 2 points Ben made. And in his defense, I get why he doesn't want to talk about the USSR. If I was a socialist, I wouldn't want to talk about the USSR either. But it's simply not true that this was something that all socialists rejected. If you look, you with both Maoism and Stalinism, you can go back and find all these people gushing over these ideologies. Balzac, and has anyone seen the movie Mr. Jones? Walter Duranty is the bureau chief. He's an American journalist. He wins a Pulitzer Prize. Oh, he loved the Soviet Union, and he hid the atrocities being committed there. A British journalist went and exposed him, and he publicly lied and denounced him for this. But this idea that everybody understood that, so the Soviet Union was bad, Maoism was bad, is simply not true. You can find dozens of quotes of people gushing about this is the future. We finally figured it out. And I think that's important. Now, again, in Ben's defense, I get why he doesn't want to talk about that. Like, let's turn the page. We don't want to talk about those. Let's look at socialism in the future. But I want to touch this for a minute, like on some of the threats that would face us today. They're very different than, nobody is really advocating, with the possible exception of a few people, of these command-style economies. And that's good, right? What we're seeing now is sort of like this incremental, I don't even want to call it socialism. I think it's kind of what Lenin called state capitalism or economic fascism or whatever you want to call it, where the state is just involved in all these aspects of our life. And it regulates more and more, it taxes more and more. And I think that is a threat. It's a different threat than a Bolshevik takeover, right? It's different. But if you look today, it's more like that, to quote Bastiat again, the government is that great fiction by everybody wants to live at the expense of someone else, right? And that's what we're seeing. We have a $31 trillion national debt, folks. That is snowballing rapidly. Social Security is going to go insolvent in 2035, which means there's going to be adjustments and more taxes, which means that that's going to increase faster. Medicare has its own unfunded liabilities. This is getting serious, and it's all based on this idea that we can live at the government's going to pay for all this, and we're doing it. There's $1 trillion deficits as far as the eye can see. Okay, this is dangerous. Soon we're going to be spending $1 trillion every year just to finance the federal debt. It's pretty shocking. And there are no easy solutions to this, sadly. Like, capitalism is a powerful engine, but even that, it's going to be difficult to dig out of this. I have 3 children. I'm terrified for their future and their children. I don't think we understand what we're doing, the hole we're digging ourselves in. And again, is that socialism? I don't think it's the same thing as socialism. I think it's a state capitalism where, basically you have government and private industry kind of working together and rigging the game. And Ben wasn't wrong. He brought up something very important. Income inequality, it is worse. But if you look, income inequality has exploded since 1971. It's exploded. And that is when the state took over, like basically they got off the gold standard, right? And we went to a total fiat currency, where we just have a credit card now, and we can. You look, Congress rarely budgets anymore. We just run up massive deficits, and to think there's no threat to that, I think is a mistake. It's different than the threat of old style socialism. But if I leave you with one thing today, I think it is. I want you to think seriously about the means we use to build a society. Okay, I think socialists often focus on the ends. They want this great society, and they're comfortable using coercion and just taking from people without their consent. I don't think that is the way to build a peaceful, harmonious society. When you can look at other people's stuff and say, I want what is theirs. It builds resentment, it builds discontent. And that's all I have for today. Thank you very much for attending this conversation. I enjoyed it a lot.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.